Texas, 1944. The sun burned white above the barbed wire fences, turning the air into a trembling haze. Beyond perimeter, hundreds of captured German soldiers marched in silence, boots scuffing dry soil, faces hollow from months of war, eyes fixed on the ground. They had crossed the Atlantic in chains, crammed into dark cargo holds. Rumors had spread like wildfire among them, stories of torture, starvation, and execution awaiting every Nazi prisoner on American soil. To most, this was supposed to be the end. They expected hell. Hell for the bombings, for the atrocities, for the Reich they had served. But as they entered Camp Hearne, something was wrong. There were no whips, no barking guards, no rifles aimed at their backs. Instead, they saw tables lined with food, fresh bread, steaming coffee, and, to their disbelief, a guard handing out bottles of Coca-Cola. A few meters away, another soldier scooped vanilla ice cream into metal bowls and passed them through the wire. For the first time in years, they heard laughter, not mockery, but something else, something normal. Sergeant Wilhelm Stadelmann wrote in his diary that night, "We were ready to suffer. Instead, they offered us dessert." What these men didn't yet understand was that this was not weakness, this was strategy. And that summer of 1944, they were not just prisoners of war. They were the first witnesses of America's most unexpected weapon, kindness as power. It began not with cruelty, but with logistics. By 1943, after the fall of North Africa, the United States faced a new kind of problem: victory. Tens of thousands of German soldiers captured in Tunisia had to be stored somewhere. Britain was overcrowded, the front lines were moving east. So Washington made a decision that stunned even its own officers: send them to America. By the summer of 1943, ships that once carried troops to Europe now returned across the Atlantic filled with enemy soldiers. They arrived in New York, Virginia, and New Orleans, disarmed, disoriented, and silent. Within months, more than 350,000 German prisoners were scattered across the American heartland: Texas, Alabama, Iowa, Nebraska. It was an empire of fences, over 500 camps built by engineers of the U.S. Army Corps. Each site was designed with mathematical precision: 2 layers of barbed wire, guard towers at every corner. But inside those fences, order, not vengeance. Every prisoner would receive 3 full meals a day. Each would have access to medical care, sports, even libraries. Officers were separated from enlisted men, following the Geneva Convention word for word. Many Americans called it madness. Newspapers questioned why enemy soldiers were being fed while ration cards starved civilians. A senator from Kansas wrote, "We are treating Hitler's men better than our own." But the War Department saw something else, a different kind of weapon, one that could strike deeper than any bomb. Behind those fences, the United States would demonstrate its system, its abundance, its confidence, not through propaganda, but through experience. The camps were not designed just to hold the enemy. They were designed to redefine him. It was an experiment in controlled mercy, the industrialization of dignity. A quiet psychological campaign built from wood, wire, and the taste of things the enemy had never known: coffee, bread, ice cream, freedom. No one realized it yet, but this network of camps would soon become the most subversive weapon America ever built, a weapon that conquered not the body, but the mind.
The first German prisoners arrived in silence. Convoys of buses rolled through small American towns, watched by farmers who had lost sons in Europe. Behind the glass, men in tattered Feldgrau uniforms stared out, uncertain if this was their last sunrise. They had been told to expect beatings, starvation, perhaps even execution. Some still believed they would be displayed in cages like animals, proof of Allied revenge. But when the gates opened, the shock began. At Camp Swift, Texas, Army reports described it plainly. Prisoners refused to eat. They believed the food was poisoned. For days, untouched trays piled up, bread, potatoes, even meat. The Germans, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, were certain it was a trick. The enemy, they had been told, was barbaric. Mercy was weakness, and weakness did not exist in the Reich's mythology. And yet, the guards were polite. They used "sir." They allowed correspondence. They returned salutes. The contradiction tore at the prisoners' sense of reality. If the Americans were monsters, why did they treat captives like soldiers? If the Reich was invincible, why were they the ones behind wire, and fed better than at the front? Resistance came not with guns, but with pride. Inside the compounds, Nazi officers enforced ideological discipline. They ordered salutes to Hitler, banned English language, and punished men who accepted American cigarettes or joined soccer matches. At Camp Aliceville, several moderates were beaten by hardliners for cooperating with guards. The Americans watched and waited. They did not intervene. Not yet. Because this was the test, the moment when ideology collided with reality. Each meal, each kind gesture, each mundane act of fairness, it was acid slowly eating through steel. The prisoners were losing something far deeper than a battle. They were losing certainty. For the first time, doubt began to whisper in the quiet of the barracks. And that whisper, that crack in the armor of belief, was the true first defeat of the Reich inside America's fences. They had prepared for pain, but not for dignity. They had trained to endure brutality, but not kindness. And in that unexpected mercy, their sense of superiority began to decay. The enemy had not broken their bodies. It had begun to break their faith.
It happened quietly. No battle, no announcement, no single moment of surrender. Just a slow, invisible erosion. One meal, one gesture, one human exchange at a time. By the summer of 1944, something strange began to spread across the network of American POW camps. The hatred was thinning, and in its place, curiosity. At first, it was the food. Reports from Camp Shelby and Camp Hearne mentioned prisoners asking for recipes, trying to recreate the soft white bread they'd never tasted before. Others began collecting Coca-Cola bottles as souvenirs, proof that the mythical decadence of the West was in fact delicious. Then came education. Inside Camp Aliceville, Alabama, prisoners started small classes, English, mathematics, even philosophy. American officers noticed something remarkable. The more they gave the Germans responsibility, the more disciplined they became. They began running their own bakeries, orchestras, and even newspapers. One of these, Der Ruf, the Call, was produced under American supervision but written entirely by German POWs. Its articles discussed democracy, literature, and science, subjects banned or twisted under Nazi ideology. For the first time in years, they were allowed to think without fear. The turning point was psychological, not military. The Reich had trained its soldiers to see the world in absolutes, strength and weakness, master and slave, purity and decay. But here, in captivity, the world blurred. When an American guard loaned a prisoner his pocket Bible, when a black soldier shared a cigarette through the fence, when jazz records drifted from a camp loudspeaker into the summer night, each of these moments cracked the myth of superiority a little more. The men began to write home describing what they saw. They told families that Americans treated prisoners well, that the nation they were taught to hate was neither savage nor collapsing. Some even confessed admiration for it. The change alarmed the German officers inside the camps. They tried to reassert control, forbidding fraternization, punishing those who questioned the Reich. But it was too late. The idea had escaped. The enemy had done something no interrogator could. It had shown them an alternative. No speeches, no leaflets, just life. Comfortable beds, books, music, decency. The invisible weapon of democracy was working, not through force, but through contrast. And though the prisoners didn't yet know it, many of them would return to Germany carrying that idea home like a virus, one that would outlast the Reich itself.
By late 1944, the war that had promised 1,000 years of glory was crumbling in less than 5. The Reich was burning from the inside out. Cities reduced to ash, trains bombed into silence, families scattered in the rubble. And across the ocean, behind American fences, a different kind of terror was spreading, not born from whips or hunger, but from the unbearable realization of contrast. The men who had once marched under the banner of supremacy now lined up each morning for breakfast, prepared by their captors. Eggs, coffee, toast. Things their families back home could no longer find in a collapsing Germany. In Camp Hearne, an American officer recorded in his diary, "They are polite, grateful, and almost embarrassed. Some write letters home describing how well they eat. They have begun to fear the war will end because it means going back." By 1945, U.S. intelligence estimated that nearly 1 in 4 prisoners expressed reluctance to return to Germany. Some even volunteered for agricultural work, picking cotton and harvesting crops beside American civilians. They sang in the fields, spoke broken English, and were paid in cigarettes and candy bars. It was here, not on a battlefield, that Hitler's mythology truly died. The image of a brutal, merciless enemy collapsed beneath the weight of hamburgers, jazz, and freedom. American guards, many barely out of high school, could see it in the prisoners' eyes. Disbelief. The world they had been taught to fear was richer, calmer, more humane than the one they had fought for. A report from Camp Aliceville noted, "The prisoners have ceased to speak of victory. They speak now of what they will do when they are free." In the barracks at night, letters arrived from home. Letters describing bombed-out cities, starvation, cold winters. One POW, a sergeant from Hamburg, wept openly when he read that his wife was queuing for horse meat. He looked down at his dinner plate, roast beef, mashed potatoes, apple pie, and realized that the enemy fed him better than his own nation could feed its citizens. For the Americans, this was not indulgence, it was precision. The military understood the psychological stakes. Every meal served was a message. Every act of fairness, a quiet broadcast of strength. To the prisoners, the kindness became unbearable, because with every comfort they received, the image of their Führer grew smaller, weaker, irrelevant. They were living proof of Germany's failure, and their greatest fear was no longer death, but returning home to face it. By the spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing under its own madness. But inside those fences, in the calm of an American afternoon, the sound that echoed wasn't gunfire, it was laughter. The laughter of men who had expected hell and found instead the cruelest weapon of all, mercy.
The Americans called it compliance through humanity. Historians would later call it something else, psychological warfare by kindness. What had begun as an act of policy became, by 1945, a deliberate doctrine. The United States had turned its prisoner of war system into a mirror, one that reflected the moral collapse of the Reich back at its soldiers. It was not born from pity, but from calculation. Because in a world torn apart by ideology, the most dangerous message a democracy could send was proof that it worked. Inside the barbed wire, that message was unavoidable. Every warm meal, every repaired uniform, every orderly camp inspection, all of it whispered the same truth. This is what strength without cruelty looks like. While Germany's factories burned and its cities starved, the prisoners of Hitler ate fresh fruit and ice cream. While the Gestapo executed deserters in the streets of Berlin, the Americans handed the enemy Coca-Cola and let them play soccer. It was not mercy, it was demonstration. The weapon was contrast. To fight a totalitarian machine that thrived on fear, America deployed abundance. To defeat the idea of racial superiority, it offered normalcy and freedom, not to allies, but to enemies. Documents from the War Department make it clear. The treatment of POWs was designed to project confidence, not compassion. The United States was powerful enough to be generous. And generosity, when industrialized, became propaganda, more potent than any radio broadcast. The Red Cross reports confirmed it. The Reich could not compete with decency at scale. It could not match the production of humanity. In the barracks, the prisoners began debating politics, ethics, philosophy, things long forbidden under Hitler. Some even wrote essays questioning fascism itself. One former U-boat officer confessed in the post-war interview, "We did not lose because of tanks or planes. We lost because we saw that the enemy's world functioned, and ours did not." That was the real victory, not won through annihilation, but through exposure. The realization that the freedom they had been taught to despise had outproduced tyranny in every measurable way, even in captivity. This was the new battlefield, the human mind. And the weapon was not a gun, or a bomb, or a threat. It was dignity, mass-produced by a nation powerful enough to afford it. By the time the war ended, the lesson was clear. Empires ruled by fear could conquer armies. But only empires ruled by freedom could conquer belief.
By the summer of 1946, the war was over. The flags had fallen, the Reich had dissolved, and the survivors of its dream stood behind wire, waiting to go home to a country that no longer existed. The repatriation ships began to sail. Men once feared as conquerors now lined up with duffel bags and photographs, boarding quietly under the watch of the same guards who had fed them. They were thinner, older, and strangely calm. For many, leaving America felt like punishment. Letters recovered from Camp Hearne revealed prisoners writing that they dreaded going back. Some even begged to stay, to work the farms, to live among the people who had shown them an impossible contradiction: defeat without humiliation, captivity without hatred. When they reached Germany, they saw what they had escaped: bombed cities, broken families, ash where pride used to stand. And it was there, among the ruins of their homeland, that the final judgment came. Because the question they carried back was not, "Why did we lose?" It was, "Why did the enemy win so differently?" The answer was written in every memory of sunlight on American soil, in the laughter echoing across camp fences, in the first sip of Coca-Cola, in the taste of ice cream on a day when they expected hell. They had come to America as instruments of tyranny. They left as witnesses to a civilization that did not need fear to assert its power. Historians would later call it psychological warfare, but for the men who lived it, it was something far stranger, a glimpse of the world they had been told could never exist. The same soldiers who once shouted "Sieg Heil" returned home speaking quietly of fairness, of order, of decency. And years later, when Germany rose again, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, it was built, in part, by men who had once been prisoners of a freedom they did not understand. They had expected the lash and found mercy. They had expected revenge and found respect. They had expected hell and found America. The irony was absolute. The weapon that defeated them was not forged in steel or fire. It was served on a tray, cold, sweet, and unforgettable. They expected hell, but found ice cream, Coca-Cola, and freedom. And in the silence that followed, the world changed forever.